Steve, there were some interesting considerations that we were talking about the other day regarding the voice in the portamento section, but can we just go over that section briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So the voicing section you see here down in the bottom right of Serum, we have a couple switches here which are somewhat standard to synths, which is a mono switch, which means, of course, one note at a time. And then we have a legato switch, which is determining whether or not the envelopes and LFOs, if the LFOs are set to trigger and will re-trigger on new notes. So with legato off, they will re-trigger every time there's a new note played. With legato on, if we're holding down a note and we press a new note, the envelopes do not re-trigger. So that's kind of standard fare. You'll notice that as the mono switch is enabled, our poly gets grayed out there because there is no poly if you're mono, right? But otherwise, when mono is off, this sets the number of notes we can do simultaneously. So this is one thing that's slightly unique with Serum is that this number here doesn't refer to voices. Some synths will refer to voices down here, and it'll say, you know, poly is 96, and then you might be using 12 unison, and then it's kind of up to you to do the math to figure out how many notes am I able to play before it's going to be missing things. And so I thought, well, that's kind of ridiculous, because usually when I'm writing a part, I know more about how many notes I'm going to want to hear rather than wanting to know how many like voices based on my unison setting or whatever. So I decided to kind of undo that, make it so that the poly is showing us the number of maximum notes I can play, and then below it, it's going to give us a number which would be the total. So it's kind of doing the math for us. In other words, right now I have oscillator A enabled, and so it's the only one, and its unison is at 8.
So every time you play a single note, it fires off 8 versions of that oscillator. And if you play all 8, then you're going to be playing 64 instances.
64 separate oscillators will be firing if I held down 8 notes right now.
That's a lot of processing power.
It is a fair amount. That's actually the limit on some synths. I think Massive Synth, for instance, uses 64 as the maximum number of voices that you can fire, if I'm not mistaken. But you can go a lot higher than that. Serum will enable you to go a lot higher than that, because just on one oscillator, we could raise the unison to 16. And then we could enable a second oscillator and raise that to 16.
Whoa.
So now when I fire one note, especially if I put in this, why not put the sub and noise in there, right? So now one note is 34 voices.
Right.
And now we play a chord, and we're up there at the 100 range, and you know, more than a lot of synths will even allow you to do.
Right.
And then
so this is important for you guys. If you're seeing your CPU climb and you're not sure why, this would be a good window to make sure that you're not eating up a lot of voices with your unison settings.
That's right. I've had some customer support where people say, hey, it's using 50% of my CPU and I'm only playing 6 notes. But to me, as a guy on the end of the email, 6 notes means nothing. What I want to know is, well, how many voices are you triggering?
Right.
Because it doesn't really matter how many MIDI notes are being held, right? So this is where you can limit it. Another way that you can try to conserve CPU is on this envelope 1, trying to just make sure that your release isn't unnecessarily long. So sometimes you can just make it a little more convex, perhaps, and a little shorter.
Because you could say, I'm only playing one note, which is only 8 voices. But if you're playing the second note before that one's done releasing, well, now you're playing 8 and another 8 on top of that, and depending on how many, it can
really add up.
Into a lot of voices.
Yeah, you could do an arpeggio across the keyboard, and it can be a whole lot of notes all that are all ringing at once.
Right.
So keeping this poly number down in the lower right, keeping this lower, will mean that it'll start getting rid of those older notes that have been hanging out a while.
Oh, cool.
And especially if you have some reverb or delay and stuff going on, you might not really need those notes anymore. But if you want them there, keep it high. You can raise it. I made it so you can raise it what I think is plenty high, which is 32. And then what you can do is you can keep your unison a little bit lower, because the time you're really going to run into CPU problems is the chances are that you're using a lot of unison. So one thing that I also do recommend is you can keep your unison slightly lower than cranking it for composing reasons, and then raise it up so it sounds kind of like you want. If it's choking your CPU, then freeze the track.
Right.
So that's kind of a good way to work around it, is sort of have a lower unison working. In the future, I'm going to try to add some kind of draft mode, which will lower the quality a little bit for composing reasons, but then you'll still have that exact kind of full unison going on. So I'll cut some corners that I wasn't interested in doing in 1.0, where I was mostly just concerned with making the best quality possible and knowing I could always go back later.
I like it. And now let's talk a little bit about the portamento section. I really like the curved scaled feature on the portamento that you have here.
Great. The portamento is most often used with a mono patch, right? So you generally hear people gliding from one note to another, like on a one-note lead kind of a thing. So we'll set that up. We'll go mono, legato, why not? And then we have our portamento time here. So what this is doing is, of course, setting our time between gliding between two notes. So if we hit a note here, you can hear that sort of gliding between them. I'll make it more obvious. So you can hear that pitch bend up to the next note, and this is our portamento time, or how long does it take to bend to this new note that played. And then we have, as you mentioned, we have this curve. And this curve can make it so that it's not exactly linear. It's not just gliding, like if you drew pitch bend from that one note to the next, by default, it would be like a diagonal perfect line connecting those two pitches. With this curve, we can make it more of a curved transition from one to the other. So one I like often is making it convex like this, like raising it up positive. And what this does is it kind of takes you towards that destination note a little quicker than normal, and then it starts slowing down and it just glides you gently into that final pitch. So I find that's very like organic and earthy and kind of classic lead sort of a sound. So I'm going to turn that unison down just so you're a single saw. You can hear how it sort of slows down in a way once it gets near the end note, and that's sort of, and to do it even more extreme, I could make it extra extreme. It feels like it gets a little faster too because we've gotten so close to the end note, so sometimes you have to counter that with a little speed. It takes you a while to get there,
I
and
like it.
it's kind of expressive. And
That's a signature part of a lot of tracks.
Cool, right, yeah. The scaled switch is similar in a way, is that it's affecting our portamento time. Rather than being in like a fixed curve way, it's scaling it based on how many semitones, or what is the distance between our two notes. So in other words, imagine you set your portamento time to 1 second, and we didn't use the scale switch. That means if I play a half step, it takes 1 second to get to that half step. Or if I play an octave, it takes 1 second to get to that octave. But sometimes you don't really want that to be happening. Sometimes you don't want it to take so long to get to that destination note when it's far. So scaled allows you to hold down a note. You can see it takes it takes a certain amount of time because I've set a long portamento time. But you can see that these happen pretty quick because they're shorter steps. Therefore, it's scaled to be shorter. And if you think about this octave as being a certain amount of time, now I'm just getting that slice of that time to get to the closer step.
Got it.
And it ends up, in a sense, feeling more even, rather than, so it's aware of how far it has to go.
Awesome.
That's it. There's one last switch we should mention.
Oh, please.
The always switch. The always switch just means that we always get portamento whether or not a note is being held down. In other words, if I hit a note and hit another note, you can see it glided to it because always is enabled. If always is off, we don't get the portamento. In other words, one note would have to be held, and then you hold a second to get the portamento effect. So
They have to be overlapping.
yeah, so sometimes you might want the always, but default is off, and that's probably the most common scenario.
Awesome. So there you have it, the voicing and the portamento section within Serum.